Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are now going to be presenting Mapping Our Communities. The first part of this training is a training for trainers. And then we'll get into breakouts with workshops that'll feel a little bit more like the kind of workshops that you might have in your part of the country. My name is Kathy Fung, and I'm with Common Cause. Welcome back.
And I'm Sandra Mitrovich, and I'm with the National Congress of American Indians.
Great. Next slide. We are now in part 3 of the Redistricting Community College curriculum. And as I said before, we'll be covering a couple of things that are related to training for trainers. Next slide.
And in this session, we're going to cover what is community mapping, what does community mapping, or why does community mapping matter, as you heard a little bit previously in our discussion, and how do we actually run a community mapping workshop. And so right after this presentation, you're going to have an opportunity to participate in a breakout session. You're going to be able to practice mapping a community and learn about how to map using one of our free community mapping apps. Next slide. We want you to think about, we talked a little bit about our communities of interest and how we do that. It's the easiest way to think about community mapping is to start with some 4 basic questions. Who we are as a community, what makes us special or unique, where we live, and how we share some of our common interests. Next slide.
This is the legal definition for communities of interest. You'll hear that term, communities of interest, a lot of times, and sometimes it'll be in state law, sometimes it'll be recognized by courts, sometimes it's an unspoken rule, as we talked about in the earlier sessions. This definition here, a community of interest, is a neighborhood or area whose residents have shared culture, history, and policy concerns, and would benefit from being represented in the same district. This definition is a definition that you'll see variations on in many state laws or even court cases. Traditionally, no one has bothered to ask people who live in a community or a neighborhood, what binds your community together? Often, redistricting is done in a top-down way, but the conversation and tools we'll go through today will give you the power to define your own community. Keeping communities together gives us a stronger voice in government. Next slide.
So what's exciting about this is really just getting started, that first step of redistricting. It starts with having local conversations about our communities and what the culture, concerns, and counts are of each. We call these the 3 Cs. We're going to look for stories that connect our community identity with impact. And so we really want to focus on how we tell our stories. We can start this community mapping now before the 2020 census data for redistricting is released, and we really want to encourage that. We can use American Community Survey data and free mapping apps to bolster the cases we're making for each of our communities. In the next slide, we're going to be looking at an example of those 3 Cs of culture, concerns, and counts. So when we're thinking about what community mapping is, I want us to first take a look at an example of a community. So on your screen, this is Chulista in Western Alaska. If you look at the quote, you're going to notice in this example, Walter Featherly, he actually joined one of our sessions on community mapping, and he talked about the identity of his Alaskan community known as Chulista. He describes the location of the community, so note there. It's located in the Yukon, Kuskokwim Delta region of Western Alaska. And he talks about the challenges and in this quote of his community regarding barriers to transportation, and then also sometimes having to navigate that through river ice roads. So when we talk about the 3 Cs, you'll note all of those things there. The count of the 33,000 shareholders obviously talks a little bit about the culture, and then of course where it's located. Next slide. So where does this fit into redistricting? So we want to think about, after many communities have mapped themselves, we want to build coalitions to work through where our shared interests lie. There's always strength in numbers. So anytime we can, we should identify places where there is agreement. We also need to be aware of places where there may not be agreement. Coalition building should always be constant. It can be critical to overcoming political opposition, as you have heard in an earlier presentation. And we should always be asking who else needs to be at the table, what voices may not be present. Last but not least, this all builds up to district mapping. In most places, every level of government needs to be redistricted, from school boards to city councils to state legislatures and Congress. We're focused on teaching you how to map your communities, and there are ally groups that we will want to make sure that will look at how you have mapped your community, and then think about what coalitions are advocating for, and use all of that to draw the district maps when we go through this process. Mapping districts can be complicated because there are a lot of factors to take into consideration, like making sure the districts are close to their ideal population, and also making sure they comply with the Voting Rights Act where there are minority populations. We heard a lot about that in our last segment. We won't go into depth in this session about how to draw districts, but you will be able to find some resources and groups that you can consult with, or how you can take trainings with one of the groups on the Charge Hub website. Next slide.
Let's talk a little bit about why community mapping matters. First, mapping communities can serve as building blocks for drawing the districts in a city or a state. Second, by collecting and telling community stories, we can center our communities in redistricting so that we're not just an afterthought, but we're actually considered from the start. Telling compelling community stories is essential to changing how the media covers redistricting so that they're not just covering it as a political power struggle between insiders, and they're starting to tell more stories about how redistricting impacts on regular people's lives. Most importantly, it can make a difference in how the lines are drawn, possibly by persuading those who have the power to draw lines, whether that's a lawmaker or a commissioner, to consider our communities. And it may be incredibly important evidence for judges to consider if the maps are challenged in court. Next slide.
Now I want to think through the role of everyone that can take part in running this workshop. In a community mapping workshop, there's going to be different roles for different people. As you'll note on the screen, we have a facilitator. That's the person who helps move along the conversation, making sure that we're identifying specific landmarks and areas that are really important to the community. Next is the community mapper. So we want to make sure that person is the one that listens to community conversations and will also help map the community. The ambassador is the next on the list, who really is well connected in the community. Those are the folks that can really bring people to the table. When they invite people, people are going to listen and they're going to show up to that workshop. And also think through who else needs to be a part of the conversation. And then last but not least, that helper person is going to handle the logistics of the day that may come up when we're participating in a training. Next slide.
So this is one way to run a community mapping workshop. You can obviously have variations, and so we welcome other folks to try out what works for conversations with you. What we like to start with is going around the room and having each person introduce themselves. Ask people to share what community they're from and one thing that's special to them about their community. Consider this to be an icebreaker, but even in this icebreaker, you should be, if you're the facilitator or the community mapper, taking good notes and listening really carefully. Are community members describing the same community? What are they saying about their culture or character of this community? Are they bringing up concerns? When people describe the places or events that they're tied to, make a note of it, because the community mapper maybe needs to use that later on when you're looking at the mapping app to be able to put that community onto the map. Next slide. The next step is to go around the room again and ask everybody, take a minute and write down how you would describe our community to a friend who's thinking about moving here. Now, we ask this as a question about a friend who's thinking about moving here, not just somebody who's visiting as a tourist, because we're looking for key places that are important to that community member that are worth marking on the map. Here are some tips for the facilitator and mapper. You want to write it down or share it in the chat. So if you're meeting in person, one day when we actually can meet in person, you want to have some paper and pens ready to use so that people can write things down. If you're meeting online, people can use the chat box and take a minute to write about their community in the chat box. The helper can help to save all the comments from the chat box so that you can save it in a separate document and hold on to that very important information. And remember to ask good questions. Participants might mention one or two places again and again, and you'll want to dig in a little bit with that. Ask them to share some more stories or tell them a little bit more about that place. You might want to ask participants, do you want to include that in your presentation or your testimony to the decision makers, right? So taking those notes are important to holding on to that information for later on, not only when you submit a map of your community, but also submitting testimony. Next slide. After some discussion, you'll want to think about whether people are all talking about the same place or multiple communities. Do people have the similar understanding or the same understanding of that community, or are there variations? If people are discussing more than one community, you can still map these, but you'll just want to be prepared to sort them out as you're talking so that you're mapping what one person might be saying and then coming back and overlaying or understanding what somebody else is saying. Next slide. Now let's talk about the 3 C's. The first C is for culture. These are some questions that you might ask to try to get at what culture is, right? What do we have in common? What's our shared history? Are there other things that we share like language or celebrations or values? The second C is for concerns. The facilitator can ask questions to get the group to talk about what issues or services need resources or attention from the group. Right? When we talk about communities, sometimes they are unified by a shared racial identity or ethnic identity. Sometimes it might be that they all live close to a factory or a plant and they share a shared concern about both jobs, but also the health and environmental impact of that plant. The third C is for counts. You'll want to research additional data that can be used to strengthen our community stories about how we are, what our concerns are, and where we live. In the Redistricting Community Handbook, you can go to page 12 through 15, 12 and 15 through 17 to get more details about these 3 C's. Next slide. Now let's look at a real life example. And this helps us to sort of think about the 3 C's in a more concrete way. This is the port area of Long Beach in California. And sorry, a lot of my examples are from California because that's where I'm from. In 2001, in order to draw an incumbent into the California Senate District 28, legislators extended a quote unquote boot into the city of Long Beach to grab that incumbent's house. That's where that blue arrow is pointing to. That grabbed the incumbent's house, and that also meant that 2 other districts, Senate District 25 and 27, had to be drawn around the boot. This split multiple communities and the city of Long Beach into 3 districts. Next. Now let's look at the culture of this area. This area has a large Black community, and you can see that shaded in reds and oranges. There's also a mix of Latinx working class families. So when you go to a lot of family gatherings and community gatherings, you'll hear Spanish spoken as much as English. Now, what are some of the concerns? There are 2 ports, as I said, that are in this area. These Long Beach neighborhoods experience traffic and pollution from the nonstop caravans of 18-wheelers that are driving on the freeways, carrying goods that are shipped to and from these ports, right? They're picking up these cargo containers of things that people are ordering now that we're all in lockdown, right, to be delivered to their houses. And the families in these neighborhoods, like the Washington neighborhood, suffer serious health problems because of this pollution. As the story in this concerns part shows, Mrs. Zazueta talks about how the pollution means that her daughter has asthma and she has to be rushed to the hospital several times a week because she can't breathe. What are some counts that this community can talk about? One of the examples is the extent to which families have asthma. This area has so many asthma cases that it's called Asthma Alley. And as you can see, the rates of asthma are astronomical. The way communities are drawn impacts then how the districts are drawn. And the representatives who have the ports, who right now are not in the same districts as those who have the parts of communities that are experiencing health problems from the port traffic and pollution, makes a difference when those communities try to find representation to try to change or address that problem. Unifying neighborhoods that are impacted by the port traffic into one district could give those communities a chance to elect someone who would listen to and address their concerns. Next. So in 2011, when the community members came together to testify about their community and districts were redrawn by the California Redistricting Commission, that district was put or all of the communities were put into a single district. And those that were impacted by the Long Beach port and freeways now have a single voice. That new representative who was elected from this district has advanced multiple bills to address the health and environmental impacts of the trucks and ships on these communities. Next slide.